And now let us go right into specific construction materials, systems of buildings, and talk about what are the ideal and what are the acceptable building materials for them. And we're going to start at the very top. We're going to start with the roof of buildings. The roof is not so critical because in almost all cases, there is a vented space, sometimes an attic, sometimes a joist space, between the roof and the house. And so any outgassing has a way of being vented to the out of doors without passing into the building. And so the influence of roofing materials on the quality of life in a building is quite small. And therefore, within the category of non-toxic, we can say most conventional roofs are acceptable in Maharishi Vastu. But there is one roof that we most favor, and that is glazed ceramic tiles. We can think, and ceramic means clay, fired with a glaze or a frit on them. And we can think that these are so beautiful and reflective that even the heavens are looking down and smiling on buildings that have glazed ceramic tiles on their roof. But they're expensive and they're delicate, and so they're certainly not for every project. In fact, in the US, they're used infrequently, but in other parts of the world, particularly in Western Europe, they're very common. Let's move now down below the roof to the walls. We'll talk about the exterior walls. And first, I'm going to tell you what the ideal concept is for an exterior wall in Vastu. Then I will give you some examples. And then we'll move on to alternatives, which are not ideal, but which are still something which are used very commonly. And so what are the ideal elements in Maharishi Vastu exterior walls? The goal, the kind of formula, is that they would be thick, at least in northern heating climates. They would be vapor permeable. They would be self-insulating, and we'll see what that means. And they would be made of natural materials. So what would meet that formula? Well, it turns out that there is one exterior wall construction material which is widely used in the US, in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, and across Russia to this day, a traditional construction material which meets all of these points. And that is solid wood, or as it's sometimes referred to as logs. In fact, when Maharishi had a house built for himself, testing the elements of Vastu as he had reconstructed it, that house was built of solid wood. And he said something like, once he moved into this house, he never wanted to leave the house. And perhaps one of the qualities of the house, in addition to the ancient Vedic qualities that was so nourishing to him, was that the walls were truly natural and self-insulating. And when we talk about log walls, we often think of logs as being rounded. And so a log wall has a series of sort of scalloped profiles, and it has a kind of rustic look. But the logs can be planed so that when you look at the wall, what you're seeing is simply a flat that is vertical surface of wood with horizontal joints every so many inches or centimeters. And so it can look like it is simply wood siding. Now, this is not for everyone, and we don't promote it for everyone, but it is an example of an ideal material. I'll simply tell you what some of the options are. One is clay bricks, which I think everyone is familiar with, can be made so they're thicker than normal, and they can have lots of holes in them. And holes, air, which is isolated from the outside, is what insulates. So if you have enough sealed holes sealed from the outside in bricks, then they become quite insulating, and particularly if they're quite thick. And here we see two vertical columns of red bricks, and the one on the right, we see lots of holes in. But air alone, that is large cavities of air as it has, is not a great insulator. What's better is lots of tiny sealed air chambers. And that is achieved in the clay bricks on the left, which have something white inside of their voids. And that white, in this case, is perlite, which is like a natural popcorn. It's made of mineral, it's permanent, unlike popcorn. And it provides much, much greater insulating value, such that that height of the wall on the left is just as insulating as that much greater height of the wall on the right. So this is one option. Let's think about some other options. Among the companies around the world who make what are called lightweight clay bricks are such companies as Poratron and Ceramica San Pedro, and there are many others. In fact, this is widely used for infill walls in reinforced concrete skeleton buildings across Europe and the Middle East and even Asia. And other examples, there is another form which has many variations and which has been used in indigenous cultures in many parts of the world, from ancient times to the present day. And that is simply to mix clay or solid earth with some kind of natural insulating material. Straw is commonly used, and hemp is another one. And so we can refer to clay straw or clay hemp walls, and there are lots of different names. This has an advantage in that there's very little material cost. The materials are almost free, but there's a huge amount of labor. So in some cases where people are building a house themselves without skills, it's a perfect solution. But it's not conventional and it's not widely done. There is a variant on that, which is being done here in Fairfield by a member of our community who is devising a new construction system with a lot of innovations in it, including an innovation in natural walls. And he's building his prototypes even now as we speak. And as soon as he's got one or two houses up, we look forward to having him on our show and to present a new economical natural construction system. Next, as we go, well, there are two others I'll mention. One is that you can take natural materials and compress them into a block and then build as though a concrete block building, but of more natural materials than concrete block and self-insulating. And a couple of brands here in the US are Durasol and Fazwall, and there are similar brands, including them, in other parts of the world. Now we go on to not natural, but non-toxic exterior walls. And this is something which is widely used in much of the world. The United States and Canada lag behind the rest of the world. You can pour a concrete block and infuse it with an additive which fizzes as the concrete is setting up, such that when the concrete has set and becomes hard, the concrete is full of tiny bubbles to such a degree that that block can weigh as little as 1/4 of the weight of a solid piece of concrete. And so that indicates how enormously insulating such a block can be. Not completely natural, because concrete is produced from natural materials, but in a highly industrialized process that uses considerable amount of heat, so it doesn't have a perfect carbon footprint. But this is still a perfect solution for many people. Some of the common brands around the world are Hebel and Aircon. In the US and Canada, the most common system of construction is not a solid self-insulating wall. It's wood frame construction where the walls are composed of thin pieces of wood, 2x4 or 2x6 inches wide and deep usually, by the height of 1 story. And they form a cavity around the exterior wall, and that cavity has to be filled with insulation. And so now we're going to talk about the kinds of insulations that can be used in wood frame construction. Because, as I said, wood frame construction, at least in the central and northern United States and Canada, is absolutely the dominant construction system for building buildings. I missed a couple of things. I'm going to mention first, before I turn this over to Aaron to speak about insulation, I want to mention that there are some, well, Aaron, why don't you join me now? I don't remember exactly how we map this out.
Yeah.
I'll list some natural materials and you see if you have anything to add to them. One, there are natural fibers, which I think you even sold, including wool and cotton and hemp.
Yeah.
And then of course, straw is available, and perlite, which I mentioned earlier. And even there are now, there are molds, fungus, which are grown in molds and which form a permanent insulation.
Mineral wool is another good one.
Yes, the ones that I mentioned so far are completely natural. Mineral wool is very close to natural because the mineral is naturally mined, but it is produced through an industrial process.
Mm-hmm.
And another similar one, not similar in use, is aircrete, which is basically cement that is pumped out with a lot of air in it, so it comes out like shaving cream and then sets up in the wall. Other suggestions, Aaron?
We have some people in Europe who use cork block actually as insulation. And again, it has, you know, lots of little microscopic holes that contain air and gases which help insulate it. But I think the most common here in the US have definitely been wool or cotton.
Beautiful. And
besides of the natural type.
And among these various options, what would you say is the most economical?
I think cotton is definitely less expensive than wool. We used to sell it, but now we've heard there are some issues with it shrinking over time. So with all new materials kind of comes this life cycle of, you know, what can it solve? And then what do we learn over the years as to how well it really performs? So I've been hearing better and better things about wool insulation, and it's certainly extremely natural coming from a sheep, but it is more expensive, but it is a great insulator.
And I think of the ones that I've rattled off and you've added to, probably the least expensive is mineral wool, which is used almost as the dominant wall insulation in Europe. It's that economical. And do you have any thoughts about what is probably the most common wall insulation in the US, which is fiberglass?
We've obviously come across fiberglass because it's pretty standard in common homes. It's definitely not natural, and you know, it can be kind of hard to work with as it's irritating to the skin. But I think the main problem is in super cold climates, the R value, the insulating value actually decreases when you get below, I don't know if it's below freezing or below 0 degrees, but that's really when you need insulation most. So it's not ideal, but it is very inexpensive.
It also can be easily and is usually installed incorrectly if it's installed in bats, and there are gaps behind it which undermine its effectiveness because they allow circulation of air. If one uses fiberglass, and of course the fibers themselves are glass, which is spun sand, minerals, and so that part of it is technically an industrialized natural material. But what you have to do is make sure that you get fiberglass that has no added dyes and no added urea formaldehyde. And spray foams. Foams are widely used for different insulation applications, and they are, in many cases, enormously effective. They are better insulators per inch than any of the things that I've listed, and so they have a huge value. They also have a pretty high carbon footprint because they're derived from petroleum products, and the manufacture of them can be toxic. We discourage them in addition to those reasons because they are synthetic, and they therefore create a barrier between us in the house and nature. And that diminishes our connection with the intelligence at the basis of the universe. So we don't promote insulation, foam insulations, although we're always on the lookout for foams that are made of natural materials. I actually mentioned aircrete, which is a foam which is made of cement. That's okay. And maybe someday rigid board insulation will be on the market, which is completely natural. We're close to it now with the fungus-based insulations, but they're just kind of a fringe right now. They're not widely available.
What about cellulose?
Cellulose is good. Thank you for bringing it up, Aaron. I appreciate that. It's, as Aaron knows well, is composed of shredded newspaper, and newspaper, of course, is pulped trees, and so it's wood. So it is an industrialized natural material. The only recommendation that we have regarding it is that it's better to use post-industrial rather than post-consumer recycled cellulose.
And that's something that goes for all of Vastu, is better to have post-industrial as opposed to post-consumer.
Recycled, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aaron. Yep. And that is because we understand there's some subtle quality that is retained from the prior users of a material, and we'd like our homes to be free of that. And yet we want to find uses with which to recycle materials, and so we have to be inventive.